If you really want to work out who Jesus is and discover what that means for you and your life, you need to delve deeply into his life and teachings. Sometimes when you get familiar with something, you stop seeing it for what it really is. Jesus and his teachings have been a victim of this familiarity. Every Sunday we go to church and we hear a reading from the gospel. Over time, this can create the illusion that we know the gospel, when in truth, most of us have barely scratched the surface of the life and teachings of Jesus Christ. Once we really get into the life and teachings of Jesus, we discover quickly that Jesus was a radical. If you haven't encountered Jesus the radical lately, I'd encourage you to take another look. His life was radical, his teachings were radical, his love is radical, his invitation is radical. His teachings were radical 2,000 years ago, and you know what? They're just as radical 2,000 years later. And radical as they may be, they contain the answer to the question we began to explore in session 1. What is the best way to live? Even if you could prove to me indisputably that Jesus never existed, that there is no God, and that there is no life after death, no heaven to look forward to, I would still believe that the teachings of Christianity, and those of Catholicism in particular, are the best way to live. I'm absolutely convinced that there is no surer path to happiness in this life than embracing the life and teachings of Jesus Christ, as set forth by the Catholic Church. The radical nature of Jesus' life, teachings, and love is a constant source of inspiration. Let's explore some examples. In chapter 5 of Matthew's Gospel, we read, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." This was a radical teaching 2,000 years ago. What was the teaching before this? An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And Jesus comes along, and with one sentence on some dusty road or in a crowded synagogue, wiped away the justification of revenge. And the moral, ethical, and spiritual development of humanity took a complete right turn. This teaching is still radical 2,000 years later. When was the last time you went out of your way to love someone who despises you, or someone who opposes you, or even just someone who makes your life difficult? We're all persecuted. We're all persecuted in different ways by different people at different times. Bullying is persecution. Excluding people is persecution. Ridicule, sarcasm, and negative humor are all persecution. When we're persecuted, our first reaction is probably not, "Oh, I'm going to pray for that person who's persecuting me." No, our natural reaction, our first reaction, is most likely some form of revenge. But Jesus wants to raise us above our natural reactions and teach us to respond with grace. In Luke's Gospel, we hear about John the Baptist preparing the way for Jesus. And he said, "Whoever has 2 coats must share with anyone who has none, and whoever has food must do likewise." Think about that when you're getting dressed tomorrow morning. You look in your wardrobe and you see all those clothes. Then consider that there are 7 billion people on the planet today. 1 billion of those people don't have enough clothes, and more than 2 billion of those 7 billion people are hungry just for bread on our watch. Speaking of radical, you probably have lots of people in your life talking to you about chastity and encouraging you not to have sex before marriage. In our hypersexual culture, these messages may seem radical, but Jesus' teaching is much more radical. Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Guys, think about it. How often do you look at a girl lustfully? Ladies, how often do you look at a guy lustfully? Jesus said that to look at someone lustfully is to commit adultery in our hearts. Now that's radical. Jesus calls us to a radical freedom. He wants us to be free. How free? Radically free. He wants us to have the freedom of self-control that allows us to direct every aspect of our being, including what we look at and what we think about when we look at something or someone. These are just a few of the many examples of Jesus' radical teachings. But what was most radical was what he taught us about love. He taught us how to love, not just with his words, but with his actions and with his life. You see, the world portrays love as a selfish thing, The world tells us love is something that's there for our own pleasure and satisfaction. But Jesus presents agape. Agape is selfless, sacrificial, unconditional love. That's a thing of beauty. Agape, selfless, sacrificial, unconditional love. This is the love we all yearn for and usually go looking for in all the wrong places. Jesus laid down his life for others, for us. That is a monumental love. It's a generous love that places the good of the other person above any selfish desire. But Jesus doesn't just love that way. He calls us to love in the same way. I told you he was radical. On Sunday at Mass, after the Gospel is read, I asked myself this question. I asked myself, if I just live this one reading, not the whole Gospel, not everything the church teaches, not the whole Bible, but if I just live this one reading, how much would my life change? The answer is the same every week. The answer every week is radically. You see, there's a gap between my life and the life God's inviting me to live. There's a gap between my life and the gospel. There's a gap between the person I am today and the person God created me to be. And I got a long way to go, but I've started. I've started to close the gap, and I hope you'll join me in the journey. Most people think they're pretty good Christians. I even know non-Christians who think they're pretty good Christians. But compared to what? I mean, compared to Jesus? No, most people don't use that as the measuring stick. Compared to the gospel? Absolutely not. Most people don't use that as their measuring stick either. Most people compare themselves to what they see in popular culture or what they see on television and their peers. And if that's the measuring stick you're going to use, in most cases you could be setting the bar very, very low indeed. If you really want to explore the question of the best way to live, I recommend you get yourself a Bible. And just start by reading the Gospel of Matthew. Read it slowly. Think about it. Reflect on it. This way, you'll save yourself a lot of heartache and discover the path that leads to lasting happiness in this life and eternal happiness with God in the next life. Along the way, you're going to discover the real Jesus, and you might discover that he is very, very different to what you previously thought.